A single flaw, smaller than a grain of sand, hid inside a jet engine for nearly 2 decades. No one saw it. Not the inspectors, engineers, or crews who trusted the machine. When it finally broke free, it tore through steel and hydraulics instantly, leaving a DC-10 with no flight controls. What followed was not a landing in the usual sense. It was a fight against physics itself. Could 4 pilots improvise a way to fly the unflyable? Or was everyone on board already doomed? This is the horrific story of United Airlines Flight 232. The summer sky above Denver was calm on July 19, 1989. The kind of day pilots appreciate: light winds, clear air, nothing unusual. At 9 minutes past 2 p.m. Central Daylight Time, United Airlines Flight 232, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, lifted off from Stapleton International Airport. Its course was routine: Chicago first, then Philadelphia. On board were 285 passengers and 11 crew members, unaware of how extraordinary their journey would become. The cockpit was staffed with experience, measured not in years but in decades. Captain Alfred Haynes, 57 years old, had logged more than 30,000 hours in the sky, including over 7,000 on the DC-10. Beside him, First Officer William Records had nearly 20,000 hours of flying, though only 665 on this particular aircraft. Flight engineer Dudley Dvorak, methodical and calm, brought 15,000 hours, but was still learning the quirks of the DC-10 with just 33 hours in this type. And in the cabin, passengers had no idea that another pilot, Denny Fitch, a DC-10 training check airman with 23,000 hours, was seated in the back as a passenger, a presence that would prove fateful. The takeoff was smooth, the climb steady, the autopilot engaged. Flight attendants began their service. The aircraft settled into a cruising altitude of 37,000 feet. For the first hour, everything about United 232 looked like another uneventful trip across the Midwest. But in aviation, routine is never permanent. It's a fragile balance held together by machines, procedures, and human vigilance. All three seemed steady that day. The crew's combined experience approached 90,000 flight hours, a safety net of skill and professionalism. Yet in just over 60 minutes, that net would be ripped apart by a flaw no one on board could see. A flaw that had been hiding in the heart of the aircraft since the day the metal was forged. For now, the jet sailed quietly east, but at 3:16 p.m., silence gave way to a sound that froze the cockpit. The piece ended with violence. At exactly 3:16 p.m., passengers heard a sharp bang, a metallic cannon blast from the rear of the aircraft. The DC-10 shuddered. Drinks spilled. The airframe trembled with a deep vibration. In the cockpit, warning lights flickered, and the crew saw their instruments shift in ways that didn't make sense. The number 2 engine, mounted at the base of the tail, had failed catastrophically. For crews, engine failures were serious but manageable. Procedures existed, and 3 engines gave redundancy. Captain Haynes and his team began the checklist with practiced calm, shutting down the damaged engine. But within seconds, they realized this was no routine failure. Flight engineer Dvorak's hydraulic gauges all read 0. Every system, normal, alternate, and standby, was gone. In plain terms, the DC-10 had lost its bloodstream. The hydraulics powered everything: rudder, ailerons, elevators, flaps, landing gear. Without fluid, the flight controls were dead. First Officer Records tried moving the yoke. Nothing. The aircraft didn't respond. Instead, the DC-10 began rolling right, nose dipping into a slow descent. It was as if the plane itself had slipped from their hands. Haynes took over and tried something unorthodox. He adjusted the throttles on the 2 wing engines. Power up on one side, reduce on the other. To their surprise, the aircraft rolled back closer to level. It wasn't control in the usual sense, but it was something. The shock inside the cockpit was matched by confusion in the cabin. Passengers saw the right bank, heard the engine noise change, and felt the unusual motion of the aircraft. Yet no announcement came at first. The crew was still assessing whether control was even possible. At 3:20 p.m., just 4 minutes after the explosion, Haynes declared an emergency to Minneapolis Air Traffic Control. The request was simple and chilling: vectors to the nearest runway. Sioux Gateway Airport in Iowa became their target. But the truth was dawning quickly. With no hydraulics, the DC-10 was essentially unflyable. Every second in the air was a negotiation with physics, not a maneuver from a checklist. And by now the question was, could any crew land a machine that refused to be flown? The explosion wasn't random. It had been building silently for nearly 20 years. Inside the tail engine sat a component called the fan disc, a forged titanium wheel holding massive blades that spun at thousands of revolutions per minute. Each blade cut the air with force enough to lift a car. This disc wasn't just metal, it was the heartbeat of the engine. And deep inside it was a flaw smaller than a grain of sand. Metallurgists call it a hard alpha inclusion. In plain terms, it's a brittle impurity formed when oxygen contaminates titanium during forging. Invisible to the naked eye, nearly impossible to predict, but deadly if it survives inspection. This one did. Over the years, as the DC-10's engine cycled through takeoffs and landings, 15,503 times in total, the microscopic crack grew. Each rotation stretched the flaw wider, like bending a paperclip back and forth until it snaps. By July 1989, the crack measured half an inch, large enough that a fluorescent penetrant inspection should have found it. But it went undetected. Not once, not twice. 6 separate overhauls had failed to reveal it. At 37,000 feet, that crack finally gave way. The fan disc tore apart with explosive force. Shards of titanium, each moving faster than a bullet, burst through the engine casing and into the aircraft's tail. It wasn't just an engine failure, it was an uncontained engine failure. The kind designers believed so unlikely that they hadn't fully prepared for it. Fragments sliced through all 3 hydraulic systems, routed through the tail. Lines carrying the very fluid that moved the jet's muscles were shredded in an instant. Within seconds, 24 gallons of hydraulic fluid drained into the sky. The DC-10 had been designed with redundancy. 3 independent hydraulic systems. Lose 1, and you had 2. Lose 2, and the last was still enough to fly safely. But no one had considered the possibility of losing all 3 at once. That impossible failure had just happened. And now nearly 300 people were aboard on a machine designed with no backup plan for the situation they were in. When hydraulics vanished, the DC-10 turned into something no pilot had ever faced. A 300,000-pound glider that didn't glide. First officer records pulled on the control yoke, no response. Captain Haynes tried, still nothing. The plane continued banking right, nose dropping, descent building. For a moment it seemed inevitable, a spiral into the fields below. Then Haynes improvised. He throttled back the left engine, leaving the right one at higher power. The jet rolled left. For the first time in those chaotic minutes, they saw a sliver of hope. The engines themselves could be used like oars to steer the aircraft. Push one forward, the jet yawed. Pull the other back, the nose shifted slightly. It was primitive and dangerous, but it worked. Control came at a terrible price. With no elevators to adjust pitch, the DC-10 fell into what's known as a phugoid oscillation. Imagine a swing. It climbs, slows, then dives forward. The DC-10 did the same. Nose pitched up, speed bled off, altitude gained, then the nose dropped hard, speed shot up, and the plane plunged. Each cycle cost them about 1,500 feet of altitude. The crew quickly understood the rhythm. They began using differential thrust to dampen the swings, cutting engines when the nose rose, pushing power when the nose fell. It wasn't smooth. The aircraft still heaved like a ship in rough seas. Passengers felt the stomach-dropping lurch of climbing one moment and diving the next. Yet within chaos lay possibility. The DC-10, though barely controllable, was not lost, not yet. The throttles had become their only lifeline, the crude substitute for every system the aircraft had been built around. But the strain was relentless. Flying with throttles required constant adjustment, both hands working the levers, eyes locked on the airspeed indicator. Fatigue set in quickly. Haynes and Records needed another set of hands, someone who could focus only on this improvised method of control. At 3:29 p.m., salvation came from the cabin. Off-duty DC-10 instructor Denny Fitch stepped into the cockpit and offered help. The question now was simple but terrifying. Could 4 pilots working together keep a crippled giant in the sky long enough to reach Sioux City? When Denny Fitch entered the cockpit, the atmosphere was already tight with urgency. Captain Haynes and First Officer Records were trading control of the throttles, trying to wrestle stability out of chaos. Flight engineer Dvorak was buried in checklists, searching for any system response. All three men were overloaded, and the aircraft still fought them with every breath. Fitch wasn't just any pilot. At 46, he was a DC-10 instructor, one of the few people who taught others how to handle emergencies. He knew the aircraft inside and out. He also knew there was no checklist for what they were facing, but he didn't hesitate. "Tell me what you want," he said. Haynes gave him the throttles. It was an extraordinary act of trust. Normally, command was clear: captain, first officer, engineer. But Haynes recognized the sheer difficulty of using engines as flight controls. The levers were heavy, sensitive, and had to be adjusted constantly, sometimes by millimeters. This wasn't a one-person task anymore. Fitch set both hands on the throttles and began learning the plane's language. Push the left too far, the DC-10 veered. Ease the right, the nose shifted. He started to anticipate the aircraft's phugoid swings, dampening the climbs and dives by carefully feeding power at just the right moment. With Fitch at the controls, the cockpit reorganized itself. Haynes managed overall command and radio contact with air traffic control. Records monitored instruments and navigation. Dvorak stayed focused on system management, searching for any shred of hydraulics. Fitch concentrated solely on flying with engines. It was an improvised division of labor, not found in any manual, but it gave them rhythm. 4 men working as one brain, each occupying a vital corner of the impossible puzzle. Even then, the aircraft was barely stable. The right turn tendency never went away. The oscillations still threatened to overwhelm, but survival suddenly felt less impossible. Still, even with 4 skilled hands at work, could anyone really land a DC-10 using nothing but throttles? In aviation, there's a concept called crew resource management, or CRM. It sounds clinical, an efficiency tool, but in practice it means something more human. Clear communication, humility, and the willingness to listen. United Airlines had introduced CRM in 1981, but in 1989 it was still new, not universally embraced. On Flight 232, it became the difference between chaos and cooperation. Haynes never acted like a dictator in the left seat. He asked, he delegated, he trusted. Records gave input freely, even when decisions contradicted instinct. Dvorak admitted when he was out of ideas instead of pretending he had answers. Fitch, technically a passenger, was accepted instantly as an equal. The cockpit became a conversation, not a command post. Ideas flowed and nobody's pride got in the way. When something didn't work, they tried something else. When someone was overloaded, another stepped in. They built a rhythm that allowed them to stretch seconds into opportunities. What's striking is how calm their voices were. The cockpit voice recorder captured a team not shouting, not panicking, but working the problem together. Amid the clatter of alarms, they sounded like colleagues around a table. Urgent, yes, but collaborative. The proof of their teamwork came later. In simulator tests, even seasoned DC-10 crews who were briefed in advance about the exact failure couldn't reproduce what Haynes's crew achieved. Not once. Every test ended in catastrophe. On paper, the accident was non-survivable. And yet 185 people walked away from the wreckage in Sioux City. That outcome wasn't born of luck alone. It was CRM in its purest form. 4 minds aligned, egos set aside, improvising solutions together. But cooperation could only take them so far. Physics still ruled the sky, and the DC-10 was still bleeding altitude with every oscillation. Sioux City was coming into view. By 3:51 p.m., the crew had Sioux City in sight. 9 miles away, the runway stretched across the Iowa landscape like a lifeline. But getting there was no guarantee. Air traffic control vectored them toward runway 31, the longest and most suitable strip at Sioux Gateway. Yet the DC-10 wasn't responding like an airplane should. Without flaps, the aircraft couldn't slow. Without landing gear hydraulics, the gear wouldn't fully extend. Their descent rate stayed stubbornly high, nearly 1,800 feet per minute, double what was survivable. In the cockpit, Fitch worked the throttles like an organist, both hands darting back and forth, trying to smooth the phugoid cycles. The plane rose, fell, yawed. Every correction brought only seconds of stability. Haynes and Records coordinated with ATC, reporting they had no hydraulics at all. The bluntness of that statement struck the controllers. No controls meant no precedent. On the ground, Sioux City was bracing, fire crews, ambulances, police, even the Iowa Air National Guard mobilized. For years, they had run disaster drills simulating jet crashes. Now, those rehearsals were about to be tested in real life. The DC-10 lined up, but the approach was imperfect. The right turn bias pulled them off centerline. They were fast, close to 220 knots, almost twice the target speed. They were heavy. They were dropping too quickly. Haynes radioed, steady but resigned. "We're going to try to make it a runway." It wasn't optimism, it was realism. The crew knew this would not look like a normal landing. It would be impact, survival measured in fragments. Passengers in the cabin braced. Some prayed, some held hands, some sat in silence, resigned to whatever came next. At 4 p.m., the crippled DC-10 crossed the threshold of runway 22, not 31. It was a misalignment caused by the aircraft's unyielding drift. But there was no time to correct. The first contact was violent. The right wingtip struck the ground, sending sparks and fire trailing across the runway. A split second later, the right landing gear collapsed, tearing open fuel lines. The DC-10 slammed down, skidding sideways at over 200 knots. The fuselage twisted, the tail broke apart, and the aircraft cartwheeled across the field in a plume of fire and smoke. Inside, passengers were thrown from their seats as the structure fractured around them. The nose section crumpled, the tail sheared off, and fire erupted from the right wing. The jet rolled onto its back and broke into pieces. Some sections tumbled violently, others came to rest upright. For many, darkness came instantly. For others, survival was a matter of inches. Seats torn loose, overhead bins collapsing, smoke filling the cabin. Outside, emergency crews raced toward the wreckage even before the dust had settled. The years of disaster drills paid off. Within minutes, firefighters were dousing flames with foam, paramedics were pulling survivors from shattered fuselage sections, and guardsmen were escorting dazed passengers away from burning debris. Amid devastation, life clung on. Out of 296 people on board, 185 survived. Some walked away with minor injuries. Others were critically hurt but alive because rescuers reached them fast. In the cockpit, rescue teams found Haynes and his crew pinned but alive. Fitch, battered with multiple fractures, was still conscious. Dvorak and Records were shaken but mobile. Their collective fight in the sky had brought the jet to a runway, not a cornfield. That difference saved more than 100 lives. The wreckage at Sioux Gateway looked like total destruction. A twisted DC-10 reduced to fire, steel, and fragments. And yet from the chaos, survivors emerged. The crash had ended, but the reckoning was only beginning. In the days after the crash, the twisted remains of Flight 232 were combed over piece by piece. The National Transportation Safety Board launched its investigation, determined to answer a simple but urgent question. How could one engine failure take down an entire DC-10? The answer lay inside a fragment of titanium. The number, 2 engines' fan disc recovered in shattered pieces, revealed a fatigue crack that had been growing since 1971. Metallurgists traced it to a hard alpha inclusion, a microscopic impurity introduced during the forging process. It was a flaw invisible to the eye but lethal when left unchecked. The disc had survived more than 41,000 hours of service and 6 major overhauls. Inspections using fluorescent penetrant dye should have spotted the half-inch crack years earlier. They didn't. A breakdown in quality control allowed the defect to escape notice, turning a microscopic weakness into a time bomb. Yet the investigation went further than metallurgy. The real catastrophe wasn't just the disc failing, it was what the fragments destroyed. When the engine burst apart, high-velocity shards tore through the tail, severing all 3 hydraulic lines. In theory, the DC-10 was designed with redundancy. 3 separate hydraulic systems meant 2 could fail and the plane would still fly. But the lines were routed too closely together. One hit in the wrong place wiped them all out. It was a vulnerability no one had taken seriously during certification. Regulators had considered the odds of a total hydraulic loss too remote to require a contingency plan. July 19, 1989 proved otherwise. The NTSB's final report was blunt. The proximate cause, a manufacturing defect in the fan disc. Contributing factors, inspection failures, and a design flaw that allowed a single point of failure to cripple all controls. But amid the technical failures, investigators noted something remarkable. The crew's actions were described as highly commendable and greatly exceeded reasonable expectations. In a situation considered non-survivable, their improvisation had saved 185 lives. The reckoning was clear. The metal had failed, the design had failed, inspections had failed. The only system that held was human. Out of devastation came change. The crash of United 232 reshaped aviation on multiple fronts, from metallurgy to training. Engine manufacturers tightened standards, eliminating impurities through a triple vacuum process for titanium. Inspections grew more rigorous, with advanced techniques designed to catch flaws too small for older methods. Regulators mandated hydraulic fuses for DC-10s, devices that isolate damaged sections of lines so a single rupture can't drain an entire system. The lessons from Sioux City forced engineers to admit that impossible failures had to be planned for. But the technical changes were only part of the legacy. The deeper shift was cultural. Crew resource management, once an emerging idea, became non-negotiable in aviation worldwide. The example set by Haynes, Records, Dvorak, and Fitch, 4 men sharing tasks, listening, adapting, became the textbook case of CRM in action. Simulator pilots couldn't replicate their outcome. Yet because they communicated openly, 185 people lived. Survivors' voices carried the lesson further. Some spoke of trauma that lasted decades. Others remembered the calm professionalism of the crew. For families who lost loved ones, grief mixed with gratitude that so many others had survived against all odds. And then there was Captain Haynes himself. He refused the label of hero. In interviews and speeches, he insisted the outcome was the product of teamwork. His fellow pilots, the flight attendants, the air traffic controllers, and the first responders in Sioux City. He often ended his talks with 5 words he believed summed up Flight 232's survival: luck, communications, preparation, execution, cooperation. Those words captured both the fragility and the resilience of aviation. A flaw smaller than a grain of sand had nearly destroyed a wide-body jet. But human cooperation turned unflyable into survivable. Today, United 232 stands not just as a tragedy, but as a lesson written into every cockpit procedure, every engineering blueprint, every emergency drill. It proved that even when machines fail completely, people working together can still make a difference. If you've stayed with me through this ordeal, you already understand why these lessons matter far beyond one flight. Aviation safety is built piece by piece on tragedies that leave behind knowledge. And each story, like this one, teaches us how fragile and how resilient we really are. If you want more stories that show the failures, the fixes, and the human decisions that change outcomes, subscribe and leave a comment on what story you'd want featured next.